What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our week 3 must-add waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. If you do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Before we hop into today's video, I do want to quickly add that I'm still recovering from COVID, so my normal enthusiasm and my normal voice is not quite there. So I just want to say thank you guys for bearing through this video. My first video that I've done since the family and I got COVID. So if you're new to the channel, there's a little bit of a difference from what you're going to see on a regular basis, but I do thank you guys so much for watching the video. Without further ado, let's hop into the video. All right, let's start with the running backs for week 3. James Conner left Sunday's matchup against the Raiders with an ankle injury. Wasn't having a great day on the ground, but regardless, with James Conner making an exit due to injury, which does tend to happen from time to time in his career, we need to take a look at the Arizona Cardinals' next 2 running backs on the depth chart, which would be Benjamin and Darrell Williams. So when we look at what happened after Conner left the game, the better fantasy performer was Darrell Williams, but I really think most fantasy managers believe that Benjamin will be the player to step in. So Benjamin had just over 8 fantasy points in full PPR, 8 rushing attempts for 31 rushing yards, 3 receptions for 20 receiving yards total. Then when we look at Darrell Williams, he had 59 rushing yards on the ground and a score. So this is kind of a tough one to evaluate. I think both are worth going after if they are available in your league, but I think both are true handcuffs at the end of the day, and we'll have to continue to monitor when and if James Conner is going to make his return. I think Benjamin holds some nice upside, but we know Darrell Williams is extremely talented, so I think both are worth going after in week 3. All right, Raheem Mostert had himself a little bit of a day against the Ravens, and really most of the Dolphins players did, but Mostert had just over 10 fantasy points, 51 rushing yards, and 3 receptions for 28 receiving yards, so a pretty nice stat line. And at the end of the day, he just led the rushing attack for the Dolphins in week 2, so he's definitely worth a look moving into week 3, as that Dolphins offense is apparently very high powered, as we found out against the Ravens. So Mostert definitely worth a look, as the list of running backs is pretty thin at the moment heading into week 3. I've got Mark Ingram on here, as he served for Alvin Kamara's replacement in Sunday's matchup against the Buccaneers. He had 10 rushing attempts for 60 rushing yards. Really, the Saints were definitely forced to throw the football throughout this game. It was just an ugly game from start to finish, and really, I mean, Ingram was a serviceable back, and I think, with Kamara just having these injuries popping up on a regular basis, Ingram is at least worth a stash if you feel like you have room for a handcuff. But that's really about it. But like I said, it's a pretty thin list moving into week 3, so I think Ingram is at least worth consideration. All right, I've got JD McKissick on here, who I know was drafted in a lot of leagues, but I think after week 1 may have gotten dropped. I mean, according to Sleeper, he's only rostered in 36% of Sleeper leagues. So at the end of the day, he had 7.8 fantasy points in week 1, and then week 2 against Detroit, just over 13 fantasy points. He's definitely carving out a role in the passing game in this offense. 7 targets, 7 receptions in week 2, and then in week 1, 3 targets, 3 receptions. So he has caught every ball that's gone his way. I do think McKissick, especially in full PPR, is worth the addition moving into week 3. All right, I threw Tony Pollard on here for those of you who are in very small leagues, maybe 8-teamers or potentially 10-teamers, especially with how crazy week 1 got. Maybe Pollard got dropped. Main reason I threw Pollard on here was because at the end of the day, it looks like under Cooper Rush and the Cowboys offense without Dak, that Pollard could be heavily involved. He led the day in yards from scrimmage for the Cowboys against the Bengals on Sunday. While Zeke was definitely involved in this game, Pollard just had a little bit of a different feel to him. So if you're in a smaller league and Pollard is floating around, he's definitely worth picking back up and adding to your roster. All right, let's move on to the receivers. I've got my guy Greggy D up first. All right, a really nice day in week 2 against the Raiders. He had 4 receptions and really made the most of them, 55 receiving yards and a score, which netted him 15.5 fantasy points in full PPR. And in week 1, he had a double-digit performance as well with just over 13 fantasy points. So I think at the end of the day, he's really making the most of the opportunity with Rondale Moore not being available and with opposing defenses really focusing on Hollywood Brown. So I think he's absolutely worth the addition. I think he's one of the top waiver adds moving into week 3. All right, man, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets is your #1 priority on the waiver wire, regardless of positional need, in my opinion, moving into week 3. 30 fantasy points in full PPR, 8 receptions off 14 targets, 102 receiving yards and 2 scores. He had a monster day, and he had enough production in week 1 that it is time to make sure he is rostered in all fantasy leagues. At the end of the day, it looks like the Jets are going to be throwing the football a lot as long as Joe Flacco is the quarterback, and even when Wilson presumably takes back the starting role, I think Garrett Wilson is going to be heavily involved, so I would not be worried. With the performance he put up in week 2, he absolutely needs to be rostered. Like I said, I think he's the #1 priority moving into week 3. All right, Noah Brown of the Cowboys is absolutely worth the addition at this point. He's really stepped up into the #2 receiver role for the Dallas Cowboys. Over 11 fantasy points in week 1, over 20 fantasy points in week 2, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 91 receiving yards, and a score. He is absolutely taking advantage of the fact that Michael Gallup is still not out there. I really like what we've seen out of Brown. I think that he continues to be productive. He's absolutely worth a roster spot and absolutely worth a waiver ad moving into week 3. All right, I've got Jacoby Myers up next, who is only rostered in 39% of sleeper leagues. And I do think, looking at the New England Patriot wide receivers, he is the wide receiver to own as a whole. I know that Nelson Aguilar had a big day, but I think the most consistent receiver is going to be Myers, especially in full PPR leagues. Over 10 fantasy points in week 1 and over 18 in week 2. In week 2 overall, 13 targets, 9 receptions for 95 receiving yards. I do think that at this point we can have Myers on our roster even as a bench player. So I think he's worth a priority waiver ad moving into week 3. All right, Josh Palmer had 13 fantasy points while Keenan Allen was out in week 2. And listen, there were a couple targets in this game where Palmer and Herbert didn't really feel like they were on the same page. I think the advantage here is when Allen is ready to return, Palmer can come back into that #3 spot, maybe have some productive games. So Palmer's not my favorite ad moving into week 3, but I do think he's worth some consideration overall. The Palmer's not my favorite addition moving into week 3, but because of that Chargers offense and how high-powered it is, I do think he's worth a look moving into week 3. All right, I put Jahan Dotson last because there really shouldn't have been any reason he's still available in your league, but maybe if you're in a smaller league, he's still floating around, or maybe if your league mates were more crazy about Curtis Samuel, Dotson is still floating around. Dotson needs to be rostered. Sleeper leagues, he's rostered in 66% of leagues, so I definitely know that he's shot up, but it really should be closer to 99. This rookie is really showing up and showing how productive he is going to be throughout the season. 18 points in week 1, 17.9 in week 2. He had just 5 targets in each game, and he is making the most out of every single target. I would put Dotson right next to Garrett Wilson as 2 rookie receivers who absolutely need to be rostered, and if they are available in your league, are top priorities moving into week 3. All right, let's move into quarterbacks and tight ends. I tried to throw a couple more quarterbacks on here because of the injury to Trey Lance with his broken ankle. So we've got Tua, who had an absolutely incredible game, 52.8 fantasy points. Shout out to Tua time, man. 50 passing attempts, 36 completions, 469 passing yards, 6 touchdowns. What a day, and really what a performance. I mean, it was just a great game overall, and Tua really stepped up at the end of the game. I know he's rostered in most leagues, but I do think that he's worth the addition. If you are in need of a quarterback, we can definitely look to stream Tua throughout the year. Carson Wentz, if he is still floating around, although he started off very poorly against the Detroit Lions, ended up with a very nice stat line and still threw for over 330 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and had over 34 fantasy points. So I still have some faith in Carson Wentz, and I think he's going to continue to have a good season at the end of the day, even if he has some slower paced games and everything like that. Jared Goff at the end of the day also had 34 fantasy points. It looks like the Lions are for real. So Goff throws for 4 touchdowns. I think he's worth an addition if you need a quarterback. And I still am a fan of Marcus Mariota at the end of the day. He can still offer some rushing upside, although he didn't have a great day on the ground versus the Rams. He still had 19 fantasy points. I don't see a crazy high ceiling on a weekly basis for Marcus Mariota, but at the end of the day, I do think that he offers a stable enough floor that you can start him if you absolutely need to. I threw Trevor Lawrence on here because he got enough done in week 1 at 16.4 fantasy points, and then enough done in week 2 with 22.5 fantasy points, 235 passing yards, and 2 scores versus the Colts. That, once again, Dak going down and then Trey Lance going down, I know that there are some of you out there who are really going to be in need depending on the size of your league as a whole. Joe Flacco, I mean, let's face it, over the next 2 weeks, while Flacco is a starter, and that's assuming that Wilson is ready by week 4, the Jets are going to throw the football a lot. Joe Flacco had 59 passing attempts in week 1 and 44 in week 2. He had 34 fantasy points in week 2. He gets Cincinnati and then Pittsburgh. They're not phenomenal matchups, but they're not bad. If you're in a bad enough position, maybe we're rolling the dice on Joe Flacco moving into week 3. I know it sounds crazy to say. All right, very quickly, we'll go over tight ends. Logan Thomas is worth a roster spot. Let's face it. I mean, we just talked about Carson Wentz. The Commanders look like they're going to be able to get it done offensively, at least from a fantasy perspective. Thomas had 12.7 fantasy points in week 2. He found the end zone. Is he going to be a little bit touchdown dependent? Sure. But your waiver wire tight ends are usually going to be a little bit touchdown dependent. Hayden Hurst has not found the end zone, but he has had at least 7 targets through 2 games. So if you're in a bad enough position, maybe you're still waiting around for George Kittle, well, you could probably consider Hayden Hurst if you want to. Mike Gesicki, I told you guys last week, don't get too scared of a bad week 1 from Mike Gesicki, because last year he gave us a goose egg. This year he gave us 1 fantasy point, and then he bounced back each year in week 2. 14 fantasy points, 4 targets, 41 receiving yards, and a score. Listen, he gets Buffalo next week. It's not a great matchup, but I do think that Gesicki is someone we should monitor. He could get back to true form to what we've seen him do in the past. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel, and drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.